Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caroline Bird. I'm the manager of tours and public programs at the Frye Art Museum. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am joining you today from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish and Suquamish tribes, who have stewarded the lands and waters of what we now call Seattle since time immemorial. So please join me in extending gratitude to their elders past and present, as well as future generations. We are thrilled to welcome you to today's panel, More Than Human, Seattle's Changing Landscape. Whether or not we realize it, the story of Seattle is made up of more than our human presence. Inspired by current exhibitions, Human Nature, Animal Culture, selections from the Frye Art Museum collection, and the Boren Banner series featuring Sadie Wechsler, this panel will bring together voices from the arts, sciences, history, and the Duwamish Tribe. Together, we will explore the area's history through its flora and fauna while looking ahead to its future. So the Fryes, who started the Frye Art Museum, their history is closely wrapped with the city of Seattle as well. Settling in the late 19th century, Charles Frye opened a meat market in the Seattle area, utilizing the plants and animals and land, as well as the labor of local workers to build a successful business. While the Fryes' line of work allowed them to acquire an impressive collection of artworks that today remains free to the public, it is only one of the many narratives worth exploring. We hope today's panel brings a deeper awareness of the complexities of these histories, including the Fryes, while deepening our understanding of our community and looking ahead to our collective future. The discussion today will be moderated by Kathleen Chapman, the guest curator of Human Nature, Animal Culture. Chapman is an associate professor of art history at Virginia Commonwealth University. She specializes in late 19th and early 20th century European art, particularly German modernism. Her publications include Expressionism and Poster Design in Germany from 1905 to 1922, Between Spirit and Commerce, and articles focusing on art, visual culture, and collecting practices in Wilhelmine and Weimar, Germany. Thank you everyone again for joining us this afternoon. We really hope you enjoy the program, and I'll turn it over to our moderator, Kathleen. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thanks, Caroline, very much. And welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We have a wonderful panel today, and I have the great pleasure of actually moderating it. Just a few statements about how I am sort of approaching the collection at the Frye. I had the pleasure of curating the Human Nature, Animal Culture exhibition. And it was a really great way of engaging with the collection. If you haven't seen the exhibition before, you're familiar with the collection or not, I encourage you to go because it's a nice way of rethinking sort of the history of Seattle and the ways that the Fryes were choosing particular types of work to fill out their impressive art collection. And I'm very interested in the relationships in this show between domesticated animals and humans. And a lot of the images, and Caroline, if you could maybe share the screen briefly and just kind of run through the slides even, just kind of quickly. So this, image of swine kind of in a very happy place next to a can of lard. This is kind of the reality of the Fryes collection. They also collected a lot of very idyllic images of animals. So in this one, for instance, by Gorter, you see sort of very, very tiny little houses and farms in the background, but nature is in the foreground. And this is the type of relationship that seems to be very dominant in the types of paintings that the Fryes collected. Nature and humans are in harmony. And yeah, you can just show the other two slides then. Thank you. And then this slide, I'm sure you saw before if you signed up for this particular panel. So given these very, very idyllic images that the Fryes collected of humans and domesticated animals sort of working together, out following the cycles of the day, the seasons, etc. It's interesting to think about how actually, in fact, the Fryes made their money, which was through meat processing, and obviously the slaughter of cattle, and the sort of importance that meat packing had for the development of Seattle as a center of human activity in the late 19th and into the early 20th centuries. So those are kind of really interesting histories to think about. And sort of moving away from those sort of ideals about how humans and animals might relate to each other, we're going to focus today's discussion around the ways that the history of this region of what we now call Seattle has changed over time. And we've got a great range of perspectives from a variety of people whom I will introduce now. So our panelists, we have 4 panelists today. We are going to be joined by Frederick Brown. He is an independent scholar and a book indexer based in Seattle. He received his PhD in history from the University of Washington in 2010. And he has worked for 10 years as an historian for the National Park Service. His award-winning book, The City is More Than Human, An Animal History of Seattle, it considers the role of animals as property, symbols, and friends in the evolving city. So welcome, Fred. And our next panelist, and I'm going alphabetically, is Desiree Rose Fagin. She is a Duwamish tribal member, and she serves on the tribal council. She is a wife and mother of 4 amazing children. Egan was born in Seattle, Washington, and has lived in the Puget Sound her entire life. She feels it an honor to serve her people and continue in moving forward with the work her family has done as stewards of this land. So welcome, Desiree. And then we have Sadie Wechsler. Sadie is the artist who has done the installation on the Boren banner. And she received her BA from Bard College in 2007 and an MFA from Yale School of Art in 2013. Her work has been shown nationally and internationally. She has had solo shows in Culver City, California, and at Gallery for Culture in Seattle. In 2016, Wechsler self-published her first monograph, Part 1, Redo, and her work is included in the collections of Yale School Art Library, the Hammer Museum at UCLA in California, and at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, and in the King County Portable Collection. So welcome, Sadie. And then we have Ken Workman joining us as well. Ken is a Native American from the Duwamish Tribe and 5th generation great-grandson of Chief Seattle. Ken is retired from the Boeing Company's Flight Operations Engineering Group. He is a member of the Duwamish Tribe, a former Duwamish Tribal Council member, as well as the former president of Duwamish Tribal Services, the nonprofit arm of the Duwamish Tribe. Today, he enjoys his retired life, where he takes long walks in the mountains east of Seattle, where he lives on a river. Welcome, Ken. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And I'm just going to start off sort of like leading from a lot of the themes in my exhibition, which I borrowed, I have to say, very heavily from Fred's book, which was, I thought, very illuminating for the history of Seattle for me. And what I'd like to do is sort of think a bit about the ways that the city has developed, how people have used the land in and around, and how food has had a really important impact on the way that we think about the cityscape. What kind of plants are around the city, what kind of animals are around the city or are not in the city any longer, or we're trying to maybe think about reintroducing, et cetera. So Fred, I'm going to direct this first question to you, and everybody else, please feel free to chime in. So one of the factors, so Fred, you have traced some of the many ways that animals have affected the development of Seattle from the arrival of the white settlers onward. And you also do a bit of the prehistory as well. But could you talk a bit about how distinctions between what was considered to be town or city, in other words, the sort of human development, and what was considered to be nature or wilderness were made, or how do people actually start carving up the land into the town or the city and the wilderness? If you can trace a bit of that early history of Seattle.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be here. think European settlers had this distinction between wild and domestic, and they would frame it in terms that, are we would disagree at the day of talking about civilization and savagery. And I think those early white settlers saw this distinction, and they were trying to create a different European space as they were dispossessing the Duwamish people who have been here since time immemorial. They were trying to create this separate European space, and animals were very central to their vision of what an appropriate use of the land was. So as they came here, they brought a whole cohort of different animals, all at once. Not that they gradually brought them, but within a few years they had cattle and horses and pigs and chickens and all this cohort of how they saw the world. And I think in their mind there was this association in some sense between race and a set of animals and an appropriate land use. And you see that. I'll just give one example and then let other people jump in. You see that in the Oregon Land Act of 1850, which was a legal document that allowed European settlers in their minds to rightfully own this land. And that document, it said that white people could own land if it was cultivated. And cultivated land implies animal agriculture, implies European-based animal agriculture, not the traditional kinds of agriculture that had been here in the past. So from their point of view, these animals were central to their claim to owning land here. And we could also talk about the physical transformation of the land, but I'll just leave it at that and let other people jump in.
Yeah, thank you. So Ken and Desiree, I mean, sort of thinking about how the settlers, that the European settlers came in and sort of really reconfigured how they were using the land. If you want to talk a little bit about maybe the historical sort of relationships that the Duwamish has had with the land and how things were altered then, or how the Duwamish reacted to the alterations, or how historically that has been sort of interpreted or managed or lived with or resisted.
Well, that's a very large question. So thank you for it, I guess, Kathleen. So how have the Duwamish adjusted to the changes that have happened since 1851, the 1850s until now? And I guess we've survived. We're still here. And I'm coming to you today from West Seattle, just above the Fauntleroy Ferry. So the Duwamish people still occupy this land. We've adjusted to the changes, but one would have to remember that we lived in harmony with nature for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so when you introduced me as fifth generation great grandson of Chief Seattle. And so in 1851, he's standing on the shores of a beach over here, Alki Beach, and he says something like, La Leodicea Adichapad. Welcome, my friends, onto this land, of the ancient Duwamish. And at that time began the big change. And we have in our mythology a person called Dokwibat, the changer. And Dokwibat was responsible for changing everything from an amorphous spiritual world into all the people and the trees and the salmon and the killer whales and the birds that we see today. So for us, we've been living in harmony with all of the trees and the creeks and the bears and the birds forever and ever, and we recognize them as part of us. And so now we introduce this modern society that Fred was talking about, and these people come over here and all of a sudden they do this land cultivation thing, and they bring these new strange animals. And so it was a radical change. It's still a radical change because 170 years is just a blink of an eye to us. And so we're still in the process of it. And we recognize that the world is a modern world. And I use, I'm retired from aerospace as a flight operations engineering data analyst. And so here I am, an ancient person living in a modern world trying to adjust. So we would say that we're still here, but I don't want to take up all the time because I recognize Desiree's right there. And so I'm gonna pass on to Desiree to see, to hear her words.
Thank you, Ken. No, I was just going to say that I was always told for a long time that there's a saying from my grandmother, and she would say, when the tide was out, the table was set. So our people, like Ken said, we have lived side by side. We've used every little bit of every animal we've ever used. We honored all animals. All living creations were created by our creator, and we believe that. We live that way every day. So yeah, it was a big change when cows came, when pigs came. Think about how much it takes to raise cattle, how much water they drink, how much hay and grass they eat in one lifespan. It's a big difference when you talk about the land and how much land was being used to raise cattle, just cattle alone. So
yeah, and that obviously really changed, everything in terms of how the place looks. I mean, and looked at the time as well when the cattle and the pigs and everybody started showing up. So yeah, this sort of really sets the stage for a lot of clearing going on, and with that in mind, it's going to absolutely alter not only like how humans are living there, that the people have lived there for very, very long time, the Duwamish, but it also has a huge impact on the wildlife there and the plant life there. And Sadie, I'm interested in your work as well. If you want to talk a little bit about what you have presented at the Frye and your explorations of the changing plant life, the flora or the landscape of the First Hill neighborhood, which is the neighborhood of Seattle where the Frye Museum actually stands. So yeah, Sadie, could you maybe talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, let's see. So in thinking about the Frye Art Museum, it's a landscape that I'd kind of like traversed many times as a security guard when I worked there, and I kind of walked the perimeter. And when I was asked to do a piece for the Boren Banner series, I kind of started thinking about that like square block, and kind of it's not the most like imaginatively exciting place. It's very cement and this kind of closed in environment. And so, I guess I just started to think about the question of like, what was the plant, what plant life used to live here? What was that environment like? And how can we begin to like reconstruct that or break down, create kind of a portal into a different type of space through this opportunity of a mural-like project. So yeah, so I kind of went into a research hole about trying to find what the forest structure was like in this area, and it was interesting to see how little there was in like the kind of institutional, like University of Washington, like just within these sort of colonial institutions, there wasn't a lot of information about the forest. The first information that I found was in the surveys that were used to kind of break up and sell off the land. And the tree surveys, diameters that were taken from that. And I was lucky enough to talk to some people at the Duwamish Tribe as well, and kind of hear different perspectives and read some other books that went further back in time. But I kind of noticed this gap, and in that gap, I started to put together an idea an idea of the past of this kind of potential forest, and thinking about the exact site and the individuals that kind of inhabited that site. And I guess in terms of my research, there were two things that really stuck out to me as a little bit discordant with the narrative. I was born and raised in Capitol Hill, so not very far from First Hill. And growing up in the city, there were two important narratives that I was taught sort of about the landscape that I found to kind of be undermined a little bit. One was that there was these gigantic old growth trees and they filled the entire landscape. And it was sort of like this impenetrable forest. And in my research, I found that I think it was 16.9 inches was the average diameter of a tree. And so there'd be trees that were much larger, but also trees that were young. And the other thing that's sort of related to that is that fire was a really active part of the ecosystem. And that there was a large fire around 1700 that kind of transformed and shifted some of that old growth. And anyway, so these two things kind of undermining this idea of this sort of wet, fireproof landscape that I'd been used to, fire as being something that happens maybe on the east side of the mountains, but not on the west side of the mountains. And this idea of 100% old growth, gigantic tree forests. Those were the two most interesting things that really transformed the way I was thinking about space for the project.
Yeah, and as part of your research, were you finding that the plant life has changed really dramatically? Just if you walk down the street and you see a tree, is that basically imported stuff, or is that,
Yeah. I mean, if you think about just that picture of the banner, it's really hard for plants that are native to this region to grow surrounded by cement in this heat island with all this radiant heat, with very little access to water. And, there are we do see Doug firs, and we see some madrones, we see, some of the native trees that can survive in the landscape. But for the most part, you move from city to city in the US and you will see a continuity, there's trees that do really well in cities, right? There are these really strong, salt resistant, heat resistant. They have really deep roots that go straight down. And these are the trees that kind of can survive in these harsh environments. So I think for the most part, you can think about the kind of landscaped horticultural elements of our land as being as kind of imported and as the buildings that surround them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, because the piece is actually really fascinating, and it comes at history again from a perspective that, I mean, as you discover from your research, is really not all that well researched. So thank you. Yeah, no, the project is really important. And I'm just going to switch topics here, unless anybody else has something you want to say about the plant life of Seattle and how that's changed and the impact that has on how urban spaces is conceptualized or managed, or what's changed. Yeah, Ken, go ahead.
Well, it would be the Himalayan blackberries and the English ivy. And so these are introduced plants. And so as you're traveling around Seattle today and you see these massive clusters of blackberry bushes with these great berries on them. Well, those are all imported. Those are not native berries here. And so it's harder and harder to find the native blackberries, which grow along the ground. They're more like a vine. And same way with the English ivy. It's prolific. And so that was also an introduced plant. And so these are taking over and starving out the native plants. And so we have people today that, culturalists that are out today pulling up some of these plants in public parks and stuff. They have permits and all that kind of thing. But we recognize now that these are invasive species. And so we're trying, people are trying to return Seattle back to its original condition. With regard to trees, one of the keystone trees that I look for are the Gary oaks. The Gary oaks they tend to be fire resistant. And as Sadie was saying, fires were used around here. There's a great fire, and I don't know what year it was, Sadie, but 1700 or 1790 or something like that. But as Native people, we used fire to clear our fields, and the Gary oaks would survive. And so if you want to know where there was a native field, just start looking for the Gary oaks, the old Gary oaks, and then start surveying the area. And there might be that was a native plant field in the past. So the Gary oaks to me are a keystone tree.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And when you say that people are actually sort of going into parks and clearing out some of these invasive species and things, what role are the parks actually playing? Or how do you all understand what parks, what role can parks play and actually trying to sort of, restore the landscape?
I think, and there are a couple of parks that do have old growth forests, Schmidt's Preserve in West Seattle and Seward Park. They're obviously landscapes that are transformed to some extent, but they are landscapes that maybe give us, more of a vision of what Seattle was like 150, 200 years ago. And it wasn't all forest. Like Ken said, there was land that was burned for fields and was a landscape maintained by the people who have lived here since time immemorial, the Duwamish people. But but the parks do preserve a few bits of that older type of landscape. And there are some English ivy and other plants moving into those spaces, but they certainly resemble Seattle of 200 years ago more than my apartment building in the Central District does in other places.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, because parks are actually, obviously really important, like natural spaces or managed natural spaces. And it's interesting to sort of think about what do parks do for us actually, in terms of actually reminding us of some sort of relationship to nature. And just one quick question for you, Sadie, sort of like going back to your banner. Are the plants that you feature in that, are those actually current sort of more invasive plants, or are they actually native to this area?
Yeah, they're native to this area.
Okay. And so, so that's a reimagined kind of reconstruction then. Okay.
Yeah. I think I was thinking of the banner as this sort of like hole cut inside of the cityscape. And it could kind of function as a way to remind us of what was there, but maybe, or what still exists in other places, but not as necessarily a way to want to travel back in time literally. But for me, parks can be a place where I'm allowed to feel and sense the power of a natural environment, like the power of a forest. What does it look like? What does it sound like when waterways can run free? What does it look like? What does it feel like when we have this like substantial tree canopy, when you kind of come through the city on a hot night and you happen upon a park and all of a sudden the air temperature cools, there's this moisture in the air, and it just feels like you can breathe again, you know? And for me, like that's an experience that I think is really transformative, and it gives me hope, and it gives me like a way to think differently about the future, like think differently about the present, and to try to figure out ways that we can utilize and extend these resources into the future. And I don't think they're necessarily should or can look like, they do now or they have in the past, but finding, there's lots of new exciting research about, bringing back trees from the fossil record, or using trees from environments, in the Mediterranean that can kind of survive under harsher conditions. So just thinking creatively. But I think that space that kind of takes you out, it sort of wakes you up in a way, I think, being in these parks. And that act of being awoken, I think, can be transformative in how we imagine the future.
Great, thank you. So sort of changing topic a bit, thinking about, I'm just going to skip around here, get off my script. Basically, in thinking about, you're sort of like going from your discussion of the importance of parks, Sadie. I mean, so what kind of continuities, if any, can you identify, or do you think need to be, sort of somehow built out more, or recreated, or tapped into, if that's even possible, between the past and the present? I mean, obviously, the landscape of Seattle has changed very greatly in the past, say, 300 years. And how can we actually find evidence of any continuities between the past and present? I mean, where are, and do we need to seek those continuities, I guess is what I'm, how would you actually think about that? How do we actually sort of revisit the past or maintain a past in the present when it comes to like the natural environment, if that's possible? This is for anybody.
Yeah,
Ken.
Plant a tree. And so when we talk about the continuity between the past and the present, I would refer to Dr. Susan Simard out of Vancouver, BC University, and her studies about the migration of whatever's in the ground up into the trees. And so we as people, and Desiree kind of touched on this a little bit, is that we recognize that we're part of the earth, that we're not separate from it. And these studies are confirmed by Dr. Simard. And in her study, she was able to study the traveling of radioactive isotopes that are in the ground through the fungi that are attached to the tree roots and then up into the trees. And so whatever's in the ground ends up into the trees. And so whatever's in the past ends up in the present in the form of trees. And so where's that connection between the past and the tree and the present? It's in the trees that you plant. And so if I was looking at a modern city, metropolitan city, and people have asked me this question before, and they said, well, what can we do? There's a parking lot over here. And I say, dig a hole, plant a tree, because whatever's down there in the ground, those people that are down under there, because these cities are built on top of people like the Duwamish people, whatever's down there in the ground then migrates back up into the trees through the symbiotic relationship between fungi in the ground and the roots of the trees. And so this is the collision course of modern science with ancient wisdom, and that we've been talking about this thing forever and ever and ever. So if you want to save the planet, how do you do it? One tree at a time.
Yeah, that's actually a really beautiful suggestion. Thank you. And when it comes to actually thinking about how, cities can actually sort of rethink themselves in terms of urban design or urban planning. I mean, obviously it seems that incorporating more green space or trees, et cetera, would be the way to go, it sounds like. Yeah, I guess the question is how to get city planners to actually make room for that for more trees and fewer parking lots. That's a big challenge. What kind of other ways can we actually think about how past relationships with the natural world can actually continue into the present? And one of the things I'm actually sort of curious about is how you might understand the role of cultural institutions. I mean, something like the Frye Art Museum, for instance, or something like the Duwamish Longhouse, and you know that has been established, you know, as a cultural institution in Seattle. So, what kind of role can institutions like that play in terms of trying to help urban inhabitants reconnect with the past kind of and future kind of thinking about how we actually relate to the natural world?
It seems like one continuity is this effort, I think, throughout history and among people of different ethnic backgrounds, of Duwamish people and white settlers and other Seattleites, of trying to have an appropriate relationship with animals. And people disagree about that, what that relationship is, but you know, white settlers had a vision of what that should be, and Duwamish people had a different vision. But I think for everybody, I think there's a recognition of that we have a connection with animals, that we have a social connection with them, that we're fellow. Yeah, I wouldn't say everyone has this feeling, but a lot of people have the feeling we have a social connection with animals. We're fellow creatures on this planet, but we also have a material connection with them, and they help sustain our lives. And so I think institutions like the Frye with this exhibit, you know, helps us think about that past and look at a certain idealized image of what that connection with animals should be. And I think, you know, what we can take from that is that it is important to have that connection, that there's something very appealing about a kind of pastoral setting where farmers and cows are looking out for each other, and because it is idealized, it's hiding some of the violence of that, but it's also showing that importance of animals. So I think how to live in the present is asking ourselves the question: what kind of relationship do we want to be with in animals? And I think that's complicated in the modern world by distance. That it's very hard to see the animals that are essential to our daily lives. It's harder than it was for everybody 100, 200 years ago. And I like to say that the most important urban animal is factory farm chickens, because on average about 27 chickens are killed every year to feed and sustain people in Seattle. But when we think of urban animals, we think of raccoons and, you know, the coyotes that are moving in, and of course our cats and dogs. But I think that cultural institutions can help bridge that change over time, and also bridge that distance, so people can think about the kind of relationships they would like to have.
Yeah, thank you. Because it's actually really interesting to actually think about how, I mean, you sort of, you said, you know, it's important that people have appropriate relationships with animals. And I guess that the question then becomes like, how do we actually evaluate, as you've mapped out, like what is appropriate? I mean, and for an urban space, as you say, like obviously the distance from animals, the actual like contact with animals is so mediated. So where does that chicken actually come from, except in this plastic package? There's a distance that allows us to actually, you know, or many people to actually just eliminate the animal as a living creature, and go about their business. Whereas, you know, earlier relationships with animals before, you know, industrial scale production of food, there was something much more intimate. And I guess, you know, how is it that we can actually rethink where we are now, and get back to some of those closer relationships, or are they necessary? I mean, Fred, you've made a great argument for like why we actually need those closer connections with animals, or to acknowledge them. But how do we actually think about how? I mean, I'm a person who's lived most of my life in very developed areas, very industrialized areas. I grew up in a really industrial town. And nature was always something kind of over there, and it took me a long time to actually realize, oh, wait, animals are actually these things that are alive and do things beyond pets. And so it took me a long time to actually really embrace the fact that there's a lot to be respected out there, that when you're really kind of closed off from that, when you're totally surrounded by a human built environment, it's very difficult to make contact to that. So how do we actually kind of start rethinking, well, somebody like me, how do you get into somebody like me, into my head, that actually there are relationships that we really need to cultivate with the natural world in order to kind of get out of this climate crisis potentially that we're in. I mean, I'm not asking us to solve climate change right now, but obviously, what kind of relationships are sustainable with the natural world at this point?
Kathleen, this is Caroline, just kind of tying back to the talk about cultural institutions and addressing these relationships. And of course, saying that your exhibition is a great opportunity, but also using programs such as this to really explore these issues and experiences of our time, and thinking about art as a starting point as opposed to an ending point, and really inviting community members to join in this conversation. And so I think that's why we really valued this conversation today. And for us, we hope this program and others like it will center kind of the inquiry and curiosity that comes with learning, and then building this sense of community among our participants too. So I really appreciate what Fred has said and what your exhibition has done, and then hope that, again, we can center programs that elevate new voices and new ideas, and using art as the first step in exploring further and making change.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, that's why the opportunity to do the exhibition was so exciting for me, because it did give me this opportunity to really start thinking about how art has engaged with these questions. I mean, how do we think about other creatures? How do we think about the natural world? I mean, obviously, if you're talking about domesticated animals, that's a very different kind of relationship with animals than with, a wolf, or I don't know, with a coyote, even though those are becoming increasingly urbanized, oddly enough, or I guess inevitably enough, given the encroachment, but of cities into their spaces. But yeah, thanks. And sort of building on that, Caroline, how can we think about art or the written or spoken word as you say, these jumping off points, not the end points of engaging with the natural world? I mean, Sadie, obviously, as an artist, you've done a lot of that. I mean, how do you understand the role of your art in actually trying to engage with these histories that haven't been told?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing, I think my first love in photography and art was landscape photography. These mammoth plate photographs that were made in the West. And maybe it's because I saw a place that was similar to that resonated with me from as my home, but it felt very different. It looked very different. And I think the first step for me and for us all really is to acknowledge, in these histories, the violence that they perpetrated, and especially thinking about the history of landscape photography as being a history of westward expansion, of kind of perpetuating these ideas of manifest destiny and these kind of cleared and open lands for people to colonize. And they were people were brought west, tempted by these pictures made by the railways, and so in that erasure, in that kind of idealization, kind of in those modes sits like much culpability for the atrocities that kind of take place in the transformation of the landscape and of the people. And so I think, first we have to kind of acknowledge that. And so there's this power in making art, and it can be used in lots of ways, right? And so I think I kind of lost track of your question a little bit, but I think that for me, when I think about what I want to do with my work, I think about kind of disrupting the first person narrative, like disrupting my perspective or your perspective, and trying to get a different way of seeing. And I think, that happens all the time. Like we see a photograph and all of a sudden we understand what we've heard in a different way, or what we've read in a different way. And I think that happens with lots of different art forms, but I don't know, just for instance, like seeing the pictures that are coming out of Ukraine right now, like gives me a physical feeling that I don't get from reading or listening or even video. There's like this stillness where you can, and contemplation that can happen inside of those moments because of the work that these photojournalists are doing. So yeah, I think like getting yourself inside of a different place and reforming the type of vision you have. And I think with that, then it kind of starts to create new pathways for exploration, for creativity inside of your brain. And so anyway, those are the kinds of things I think about when thinking about like how art can help us engage differently, and how we use it.
Yeah, thank you. Because you're right. I mean, there is something about images that allow us to actually really engage with material in a very, very different way from something that we read or even that we listen to. But obviously verbal, sort of like engagements with the natural world are really significantly important as well. And, obviously, Fred, you're an historian, you draw on documents, and it's important the way that you have been able to piece together a history of the significance of animals in urban history. And animals aren't writing that history. It's a way of actually sorting through the documents to actually find the animal presence and the impact that they have. Yeah, if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's the paradox of doing animal history, that you're hoping to bring some different perspectives, but ultimately you're looking at the human perspective on these creatures. So I just like to point out, at least occasionally in my book, that there are other creatures observing this history, and they have their own perspective on that, and we can imagine a little bit how it might feel to be a cougar that's encountering strange new cattle that hadn't been here before, what it's like to be a cattle in the slaughterhouse, and to recognize that other creatures have their own perception of these events, but to really know what it's like to be one of those animals is very difficult. I was reading recently a book by a man who's tried to spend a month living like a hedgehog in a hole in the ground, and that's kind of an extreme approach to it that I haven't taken. But I think it's important to acknowledge that we're one of many creatures that are living on this planet together, and that other creatures have their own perspective on that. But so I mostly talked about those human ideas about animals and how they change over time.
Yeah. And still acknowledging how significant animals are in the process. I mean, that is our problem as historians or as thinkers. We can never really get inside an animal's head. But then for Ken and Desiree, I mean, in terms of because obviously the Duwamish, before the settlers arrived, had a very, very different relationship with other living creatures, including plants and, you know, the natural environment per se. And in terms of sort of the record or the continuities that are maintained, I mean, how, in terms of how you understand the relationship of your, you know, of humans to the natural world at this point, this very urbanized point, I mean, how do you understand for yourselves? I mean, Ken, I see like as part of your bio, it's obviously very important for you that you're able to have the time to take long walks in you know, in the mountains, et cetera, or in a particular part of the world or of the region that you're comfortable with or that you want to move through. So what is the activity like? I mean, how are you connecting with the natural world now? And how are you making sense of it, just through even the act of walking, or actually even communicating about the Duwamish legacy here?
Well, let me defer to Desiree while I think about how I want to respond to that.
Okay. Yeah, Desiree.
All right. Well, I grew up down in Pierce County. I was born in Seattle, but I was raised in a big city, Tacoma. And so for me to really connect, even growing up, my parents, we went camping a lot, and we would go to the Olympic National Forest over by Mora, and by Rialto Beach, the Quileute tribe. And we would go for like 2 weeks, and we would go on lots of hikes. And so I kind of grew up, you know, it's all full of old growth forests, hiking to waterfalls. And I've continued doing that with my children. We hike all the time. You know, we find hikes and make a bucket list of hikes. And we really, being on a hike just for a couple hours can do a lot for your soul. Really connect. And I find peace when I'm in nature, you know. I'm sure a lot of people do.
Yeah.
You know, growing up in a busy city, you know, and living in an inner city where you hear, you know, the hustle and bustle all day and sirens and everything, you know, that comes with living in a big city. So that's a really good way to connect in the modern world when you're living in a inner city, you know. You can, you know, there's little spots you can go to, but it's not really, I like to be in the woods, you know, like the whole, there's the whole rainforest, HOH.
Okay,
It's over here in the Olympic National, it's by kind of like Lake Quinault. There's some really good hikes in that area, and I've taken my kids recently. We've gone up there the end of February. We went up there, and we we're doing some hikes over there, and that's just, you know, so amazing because it's like you're in another world. There's these
and it's great that
trees.
Yeah, and it's wonderful that you're able to introduce your children to that too, because obviously if you're in Seattle, it's a pretty big city. So yeah, and it is, you know, you're registering how important it is actually to be able to get away from the city for a while as well, which is very, very necessary, obviously, for everybody. Yeah. No, thank you. So yeah, Ken, I don't know. I tend to ask these questions that go on forever and ever. So yeah, have you been able to make sense of my question, Ken?
Yes, if you tell me again what that is, then I'm going to also, I thank Desiree for stirring some memories about Quileute and La Push and Rialto Beach and all that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that, but I'd also like to answer your question. You'll have to remind me what it is.
Basically, I'm just wondering in terms of just, you know, thinking about connecting to the past in the present. I mean, It's why, like, the idea of walking seems to be, sort of covering terrain. It seems like a really great metaphor for the ways that we actually connect with the land, now. But it's obviously, if you're traversing the land, it's been around for a while too. So
this place that Desiree was talking about, Rialto, it's just a half a mile. It's a beach on the ocean, the westernmost part of the United States, almost the northernmost part of the westernmost part of the United States, where the air is really crisp and clear, and where the rain comes down. And in February, as Desiree was talking about, it's absolutely heaven out there, because the rains come down so heavy that the forest is absolutely blue-green. So when we're talking about sword ferns, and we're talking about when you look at a sword fern and it's green, not over here, not where all these plants are living in their own natural way. There's an abundance of food, which is in the form of rain. There's an abundance of food, which is in the form of soil. And the air is just crisp and clear, and the eagles fly, and the ravens are flying, and the forest is alive, as well as the ocean is crashing on the beaches. And so when we talk about the forest, and when you ask me about, how I connect with the forest out in the mountains, which is North Bend, which is right at the foot of the Cascade Mountains. So I live on the middle fork of the Snoqualmie River. And so all I have to do is open my door, and I'm there, I'm in the forest. And this is where you go to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. And so when we talk about, when I talk about digging a hole in a parking lot and planting a tree, the vegetation in the city appears to be stressed. And so when I'm talking about the sword ferns out near La Push, Washington, and how they're so very healthy, and the trees are massive, they're so very healthy. And then you come down into a place like Seattle, where it's a heavily populated area, and the air isn't as fresh and clear. You can see it in the vegetation, how it's struggling. And so that's the entire interconnectedness. And so when Desiree was also talking about, when the tide is out on the table is set, in our relationship with animals, and how we revere each living creature, that's because we recognize that these creatures are giving up their lives so that we can live. And so when we're talking about paintings at the Frye, and we're looking at these pastoral images, and they're very peaceful. Well, they're very peaceful from the farmer's perspective. They're probably very peaceful from the cow's perspective, when the cow doesn't know what's coming. But for that, we're tied into time. And so at that point, when the artist snapped that picture or captured that image, they also had this feeling, to the extent that they wanted to record that. And in many recordings, artistic paintings, oil paintings and stuff, you also get the impression of what the artist was thinking about at the time. And specifically, I refer to the Van Gogh exhibit only because I was just recently there. And so we know that the artist has many things in their mind, and they're trying to express it in this canvas. And in this case, in the Frye's exhibits, it's coming out in a lot of these things. And the Frye family, who made so much money off the industrialization of feed cattle, have in their possession all of these pastoral images of cows and fields and trees, and it looks, and nature. It looks beautiful. So I appreciate the exhibit, but I also wonder what the artist was thinking, and also grateful for having this little conversation that we're having today.
Yeah, no, and thank you for all your input too. I've got a couple other questions here. One is, and we've sort of been, I guess, touching on this, and this is another really broad question. As you can tell, I like broad questions. How do you imagine future relationships between humans, urban space, and the natural world might look? I mean, if you could actually say this is going to be how the future will look, How do you imagine our relationship with the natural world, urban space, and the other living things that inhabit the planet, and sort of foretell the future? Or how would you like it to be?
Is that open question for everybody?
Yes, for everybody. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there is a building over in Japan, I believe. It might, yeah, I think it's in Japan. It's a very tall building. It's a modern building. And it's almost like a forest that grows straight up. And so human beings inhabit these many floors, these 40 floors, these 50 floors of this tall, narrow building that's not square, but it has, geometric shapes to it. And these gardens grow out over the balconies and down the building. And so it's an absolutely beautiful building from the outside because it looks like a forest that's vertical. And on the inside, it feels like you're in a forest. And I only say this because I've seen it on the television, and they're talking about modern architecture. And so when we talk about what does the world look like in the future, when it's so completely heavily populated, well, at an extreme, this might be a kind of a nice building. So I look at these tall buildings as longhouses just stood on end.
That's great. Yeah, I like this vision. Yeah, anybody else want to take a stab of how you imagine the future?
So I'd like to envision a city where more of our relationships with animals are with the animals we see every day. So maybe fewer relationships with faraway animals, and that we eat less meat, milk, and eggs. And I eat meat, milk, and eggs on occasion, but I try to keep it to a minimum. And I think often those relationships are problematic, and we don't know what the lives of those animals are like far away. But I think it's good when there are more trees and these beautiful landscapes, and we can form relationships with the animals we see in the city. And the last 10 or 15 years, I've tried to do that more and more by bird watching. And I was someone who was really ignorant about the animals, about the birds in the city, and didn't know the difference between all the little brown birds that I see every day. And now that I know them a little better and know which ones are which and how they move through the city through the year, and how, the males and females look different and how they change through the year, I feel, more connected to these animals that are visible, and I have a somewhat more intimate relationship with. So I think the problem of distance is a huge problem of modern society. And if we can have more positive relationships with the animals we see every day, and less negative relationships with faraway, distant animals that we're affecting without thinking much about it, I think that's a better vision for the future.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know, Desiree or Sadie, what do you envision?
Can say something, Desiree, if...
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I guess I just go back to what Ken was saying about planting a tree as being the way to envision the future. I think that, and maybe similar to what Fred is saying, is like, I don't think we're going to have we don't have the luxury anymore of kind of pushing the forest or, these sort of areas that are functioning ecosystems outside of the city. We need to bring them inside of the places we inhabit. We need them to recycle the air, to process carbon, to rehydrate the air, to provide us shade, to catch water. Like, they have all of these active what are called ecosystem services, which is like, kind of feels like a way to minimize or put a dollar value on them. But these, like, there are these life forces that literally can save us. So to me, when I think about the future, I think about trees and I think about soil, both of those things as holding, kind of like being the thing we need, or else it's not going to look so good.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Did you want to say anything, Desiree? Just checking.
Well, I was just thinking, one thing I've noticed, I'd say in the last 5-10 years, when you go on walks in inner city neighborhoods, you'll see, instead of someone having a front yard that they keep perfectly landscaped with sod, and it's perfect grass, that doesn't seem like that's switching. That idea is switching. That's what people are using for their front yards, is they're making raised flower beds. They're making raised vegetable gardens. They're making it a garden, to help feed their family. They've planted more trees, and, you can see that more often. You can see that what's changing and making use of their small, could be apartments. You see balconies, you see, vegetable gardens you can grow. There's so many different, just really small spaces. You see those tower structures where you water it down the middle, and, you don't have to have much space to be able to just grow a little bit of lettuce or whatever you want, any different vegetables you'd like to grow for your family. I see more people hopefully incorporating that into their lives and in their homes with their families. And just like how Ken was saying, and, planting trees and how important that is, and how teaching your children that. And we've gone to a few events at some local parks where they've actually given out mini tree starters.
Oh.
And you can either plant them right there in the park, or take them home and plant them in your yard if you can choose. And teaching that to young kids, to plant a tree start, and I've seen that at I think it was the Seattle, I think the last summer, I think it was the Duwamish River Festival. They had like really many, they weren't too many, because some of them were 4 or 5 feet tall, of cedar trees.
Okay.
Different start trees, and they were giving them out at that festival. And we had gotten a few and brought them back home, and we planted them in our yard. So I think just planting even the idea, of that. And I think that hopefully, if you think about it, if everyone planted a few trees on their properties, what that will do for a neighborhood, what that would do for a whole city. That would be my hope, is that those little events like that can spread.
Yeah, and that's actually really great, because, and the thing that each one of you seems to be saying too is that just starting kind of really, like getting to know the birds in your neighborhood, or getting to know like they were planting trees. Very, very important steps, or figuring out ways that architecturally, this building sounds gorgeous that you were talking about, Ken, where it's this vertical force, that there are ways of actually sort of living differently, where we're actually conscious of growing, plants, and we're conscious of other living creatures, and trying to actually integrate those into our lives in a more intimate way. Yeah, no, that's great. And so I guess at this point, I don't know, Carolyn, is it time to open it up for question and answer?
Sure. I think this is a great time and a great question to end on with our formal, more panel discussion. So thank you so much for a really wonderful conversation. So we will be using, a reminder, the Q&A function. So if you have a question, please feel free to check that out at the bottom of your screen or wherever your menu bar is. and we'll go through a selection of them. So I'll give folks a minute to submit questions if you have them, but I had one question that I'm going to sneak in there. And Ken and Desiree, you were recently spoke with NPR, a really insightful conversation about Duwamish federal recognition and thinking about the fact that this is so closely tied to identity and this concept of land and place. I guess a very broad question, but if you could speak a little bit about that conversation and that fight for federal recognition, that would be wonderful.
Go ahead, Ken.
Okay. Well, the Duwamish Tribe are not federally recognized, so we don't partake in any of the benefits that federally recognized tribes get from the United States government. They're the social economic benefits that you hear quite often about. And so we as a native people on our native land are just citizens like everybody else. And so we don't have a reservation. And my argument for that is, well, Seattle is on the Duwamish land. So it's not like we could say, hey, we'd like to have a reservation and the border of Seattle would be it. Well, that's never going to fly. On the other hand, our people are here for thousands and thousands of years. This is where we've lived. We're attached to the ground. We're attached to our DNA. We're attached to our ancestors. We're attached to the very environment, the very things that we're talking about here today. And so it's not like we could go somewhere else and live. For example, you can't say, I'm going to give you a reservation in the middle of Montana and we're going to call it Duwamish and you have to go there. Well, that wouldn't work. It wouldn't work because our ancestral DNA is attached to the ground that's here in Seattle. We're attached to place. And so we're kind of stuck in that regard. And that's who we are as a people, culturally, with regard to federal recognition. We continue to fight that battle. We haven't given up and we have hope. And so that's where we are. Desiree, I'll defer to you once again so with that, because I'm just Ken. I'm an old man that's retired. retired.
Okay, and you're doing so great. Thank you. No, I just would say that, that our Chief Seattle, he signed over 54,000 acres, in our treaty that was still to this day, our people have failed to be honored. And so, and that was in 1855. And we're still fighting for federal recognition. And I would like to say that if anyone would like to, they haven't already signed our petition on change.org, where we are trying to reach 100,000 people at this time. We are still fighting for federal recognition. The Seattle is our land. That was the 54,000 acres. So, now we have a very small piece of land where our longhouse is on West Marginal Way, and that we had to buy. So we're slowly working our way back, and the Real Rent Duwamish, the grassroots organization that has supported us, is amazing. And with them and with the support of, the 20,000 people who are our Real Renter supporters on a monthly basis, we really appreciate them. That's it.
Thank you so much for answering that. And we did share some resources in the chat if you are interested. So I will move over to our questions from the audience. So this one is also for Ken from Kathy. Ken, what is your relationship to the trees as a Duwamish person?
Well, it's pretty much as I described. So when I just say that we're part of the planet, I use me as evidence of that, in that I was born in the 1950s on the shores of Elliott Bay, over by on the west side of Elliott Bay, over by Salty's, that restaurant over there. Born and raised till I was 4, so I'm imprinted on the smells of that beach and on the sound of the waves and the feel in the air. And then until I was 14, I played in the woods above the Duwamish Longhouse, Puget Park, and because my family had moved up to 21st Avenue. And so it was just, mom would throw the doors open and all the kids would run out, and we'd be gone all day playing in the woods and those trees and the creek and the ferns and all of that. And so my relationship with the trees is that we're attached to the land and we're literally imprinted. And so I just ask people when they're traveling around the world, when they run across a spot in the world where there is a draw, a physical draw that says, I have to visit this place, then I would encourage them to do so. For me, that's West Seattle. And every time I'm away and I come back into the city and I get near that place where I was born, then I become alive again. Very much like pouring water on a plant in the summertime. When it's sort of wilted, you pour a lot of water on it and it just comes alive. The same thing happens to me. And so my relationship is that I recognize that everything that's in the ground is in the trees, and the trees continue to work for us. They provide us a shelter for our houses, even in modern times. They did it in the past. They provided us our transportation in the form of canoes. They provide us our clothing in the form of skirts and vests and things like that. We had animals around here. We had little woolly dogs. If you were, kind of a wealthy native person, then you could have a vest that was lined with woolly fur. And so our relationship is that we're part of the world and not distinct from it.
Thank you so much, Ken. And I'll actually extend that question to Sadie as well, since you study trees for your work and your artistic process. So what's your relationship with the trees?
Oh, I don't know. They're just, they're just a wealth of knowledge and information that I feel like I have the luxury to interact with and to learn from. I just feel like I have many relationships with the trees, right? I love hiking in the forest. I love the shade they provide. I love walking around in the city and identifying trees and seeing, the Gary oaks, like we were talking about earlier, kind of seeing which trees attract, more wildlife, which trees are active hubs for movement and for kind of reproduction of life and food, and I just think ultimately the trees are what, for me, I just think of them as they're like the most consequential piece of our landscape. They're the things they're our saviors, and that I hope that we can learn to give them that kind of reverence.
Thank you, Sadie. I have a question from Mia that probably could go to everyone in the group, and maybe I'll start with Fred based on your research. So Mia asks, what could or should be our relationship to urban wildlife, or animals whose presence here is the result of colonialism and subsequent industrialization and urbanization, and who don't work as a companion animal or livestock, pest animals, rats, pigeons, etc.?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, that's a huge question. I think, I think there's reasons not to want some animals here, but I think it's important to remember that they don't know they're non-native, or they don't know they're a pest, and they're just trying to go about their lives. So I'm always skeptical of sort of actively trying to kill animals unless there's a sort of a clear and immediate health risk. I think I've read in places, and I think it's disputed, but I think there's a certain sense that, killing rats just reduces it temporarily in a certain place, but kind of rats are going to be with us always. There's no magic bullet, so it's probably better to find methods to discourage them and exclude them, so I would hope that we, can treasure. I think it makes sense perhaps to treasure the native animals more, but recognize that this landscape is utterly transformed from what it was 200 years ago, and it's not going to go back to what it was. And the animals that are non-native or pests are seen as pests are just trying to go about their lives and make the best they can of the world they live in, and that we should also see them as peers, even if we don't want to encourage them and build houses for them. So that's my feeling about that.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else want to chime in on that question? What could or should be our relationship to urban wildlife?
Sure. And I'll use elk as my example. Out there where I live in North Bend, and I've been out there for decades, it was always a quaint little town, but now it's being developed, rapidly being developed into many, many, many houses, large houses. And the elk out there where I live have a path that they managed to migrate down out of the mountains across some of these fields. And then in particular, a field out behind my house, up over a ridge, and they walk to the river and they drink. And so this has been going on for years and years and years. And the new calves have learned this is where you go to drink. And when these elk walk, they don't follow a sidewalk. If you lay out a sidewalk and say you have to stay on the sidewalk, they don't follow that. And if you put out a little sign that says elk crossing, well, they'll cross wherever they cross. So now we have all this urban development, and the elk haven't changed. So now they're walking through driveways and lawns and backyards because that's the elk path to the river. And it's been that way for years and years and years. So what's our relationship, and what should we do? We should understand them. That's what they're going to do. Elk are going to do what elk are going to do.
Thank you, Ken. That is a fantastic point. I think we will end there today. We're just about at time. Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your unique perspectives and incredible knowledge. Thank you to our interpreters today, Stephanie and Samantha, for making our program more accessible. And then finally, to everyone here for joining us for the discussion. I hope it sparked curiosity, and I will leave the webinar on for a little bit because folks shared some great resources, some places where they find a connection with nature. And then we also have some events coming up at the Frye if you'd like to engage further, some information on the Duwamish Tribe as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you at a future program.